Very nice.
Hello everyone, I think we'll start. Hi everyone, my name is Mark Hallett, I'm the director here at the Courtauld. It's a real treat to welcome you to what is the third of our series, our springtime series of professorial inaugural lectures. And you've already had wonderful, joyous, celebratory occasions with Joe Applin and with Suzanne Babai, who you can see over there. And we've got really exciting lectures to look forward to, of course, as well, over the next few weeks with Dot Price and, last but not least, Alex Bowden giving professorial lectures. So we're now tonight going to be celebrating and enjoying a lecture by Martin Cager-Smith. And I'd just like to say a few words before he was properly introduced by his great friend and former colleague, Chris Green. I didn't really know Martin at all before I came here. In fact, I knew of him, and I knew him by repute. His status as a curator and a scholar was, of course, pretty much legendary. And I knew him as someone I often saw at a distance at openings and at private views. Tall, handsome, thin, flitting through the crowd. I always see with that kind of wry smile on his face, very characteristically. It's always what I saw this kind of blonde, bobbing head drifting through private views, but never really had a chance to meet and to talk. Always slightly elusive and mysterious before we actually got to meet. And then it's been a treat since I arrived last year to get to know Martin much better and to really enjoy his company and his conversation as we talk about curating here at the Courtauld. And the thing that I really have come to appreciate most fully and most powerfully is extraordinary impact he's had and your course has had in terms of teaching and curating here at the Courtauld for many years, of course, now. And how I can distill that impact and that significance really most powerfully is just by saying that everywhere I go, and last week I was in LA, or whether it might be New York, or whether it might be elsewhere in London, I'm constantly bumping into your former students, Martin. Students have done that curating a museum course, and essentially tell me over and over again, and uniformly, that it was a really amazing moment in their lives, where they learned so much from what was a really stimulating, rigorous, and imaginative course, which gave them the confidence and the expertise that's taken them on often to really stellar jobs in the art world. Many of them have told me that it was pretty much life-changing for them. And I think I just wanted to essentially take this moment, and it's just one moment. We've got many other moments to come over the next few months. I just wanted to take this one moment to really thank you and to pass on our gratitude, collective gratitude for the great work you've done and the contributions you've made in relation to really making curating a central strand of what we do here. So many, many thanks to you. But now I'm going to turn for a proper introduction to Chris Green. So can I ask you all to welcome?
I'm not sure what the difference between a proper introduction and that is, but anyway, proper introduction. Proper introduction to Martin. For me, it's a double pleasure to be here. First, because I spent my career in this institute, but not lecturing in this lecture theatre. And I now discover that it has extremely low front seats. And that it's well, anyway, but it does feel right as a lecture theatre, so I like that side of the discovery. That's the first pleasure, is being here again. The second is Martin, because my memories of Martin go back a long way, and go back to his first experience, I think, of this institute, though not this place. Because Martin did his MA at the Courtauld a long time ago, and I was one of Martin's teachers at that time. And what I remember him is what I remember about the best students you ever get, which is that they teach you as well as you teaching them. And it was certainly true of Martin that he was like that. And I remember very well his MA dissertation, which was on an extremely unfashionable subject at that time. Gino Severini, the futurist, but not the futurist Gino Severini, but the Gino Severini who did classical frescoes for a castle near Florence, Montecuffoni. And nobody had researched that topic, and it was kind of completely off the map so far as the kind of modernist histories that were being written at that time were concerned.
It's falling off the walls.
It was, the fresco was falling off the walls, that's really true. Anyway, he did the first serious piece of work on those frescoes, and it had everything that he then had to contribute, I suppose. The visual side was something you remember, the everything about the way that a history was told, the fact that new research was being done in an area which hadn't been researched before, and that Martin had good enough Italian to do it properly. So it was something I do remember still, and I think it's gone back to that particular little piece of work all those years ago. Martin left, and I kind of lost touch for a while. I think started in editing. So anybody who's been supervised by him has probably had rather pernickety attention to everything they write. Anyway, he started in editing, and then he went to the photographer's gallery. And in those days, this was the 80s, the 1980s, so this was when photography was really beginning as a subject for people studying in the visual arts that was taken really seriously as a historical subject, but also as something that had contemporary punch. And Martin was in that gallery at that time when photography was beginning to be taken really seriously. And he left from it and went to the Hayward and became an exhibition organizer there. And I won't go into the whole career that Martin had in the Hayward, but it was a very distinguished and a career which really made a difference to London and to all of us, I feel. But I'll just say two things about it, I suppose. One, that the Hayward was a very different place then from what it is now, not so totally concentrated on the contemporary. And Martin, he was the kind of house curator for exhibitions that were monographic, the sort of exhibitions he's going to talk about this evening. And so he was a co-curator with David Sylvester, a Bacon exhibition, a Magritte exhibition, a wonderful Magritte exhibition. But also, he was co-curator, or house curator as it were, for magnificent bigger exhibitions which had to do with history in a big sense. I particularly remember Art and Power, which he was the house curator for, and which was an exhibition which had us looking at 1930s art under the dictators. Nazi art, fascist art, art from Franco's Spain, in a way which looked at politics and looked at social histories and so on in a completely kind of new way. So Martin was involved in a whole range of different kinds of exhibition before he became head of exhibitions, and then for about, I think, 18 months probably, acting director of the Hayward. And at the end of that period, he felt he had to leave because the Hayward was going to change course and so on and so forth. And it was brilliant from our point of view, from the Courtaulds' point of view, because that was the moment when we needed a new course to be run by somebody with real curatorial heft and experience, and Martin was available. And so he was persuaded to apply, and he, against the competition, won the post, and he's made it happen. And I think, as Mark said, we have to thank him for making something that was a kind of drawing board idea really happen in a real world, which is a difficult world to work in, where he had to get internships with a range of galleries across London. He had to run a very complicated series, I suppose, a really complicated logistical series of problems of just working with students who were doing very different things and had curating ideas of a different sort, because it was a course which ranged across from the contemporary to history. It wasn't just about the contemporary, and that made it something different. And I hope as it continues, it will continue to have that, because it had a certain sort of range which was special to it. I'm not going to say anything more, because I think Martin's going to have a lot to say, and that's what we should be listening to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chris. I feel concussed by your kindness. I'm just milking the moment. This isn't going to happen again. And I hope I think be for Chris as unfashionable now as in this subject as I was back in the 80s. Sereni's frescoes. All I ever did, I had to look up the title this morning because I'd forgotten what I'd given, but anyway. To begin with a bang, this is Maurizio Catalan's exhibition All. Invited by the Guggenheim, New York in 2011 to mount a retrospective survey. The Italian artist presented practically every work he'd made since 1989, suspended at different heights from the ceiling of the museum's vast iconic atrium, disposed seemingly at random, all to be viewed from any single position from the parapet of the ascending ground. A provocation, certainly highly theatrical and characteristic of an artist from whom we'd expect provocation, and a sideswipe at the whole notion of a solo exhibition. The Guggenheim spoke of it as a full-scale admission of the inadvisability of viewing his work in the context of a conventional chronological retrospective. Catalan himself was a pre-opening gambit, and echoing David Bowie's killing off of his alter ego Ziggy Stardust in 1973, proclaimed it prematurely his final act as an artist. What to make of this exhibition as a statement, as an experience? And I did experience it. The show was mobbed daily and attracted serious reviews, but predictably divided. The senior art critic Jerry Saltz, a controversialist himself, writing on it in the New Yorker, didn't mince his words. He'd gone prepared for what to expect. And this is Saltz. I'd imagined that Maurizio Catalan's All would look like a total clusterfuck. A supernova sparked when Madame Tussauds crashed into a Calder factory and exploded. In fact, when I first saw these 128 sculptures, framed photos, paintings, stuffed horses, sleeping dogs, a sitting cow, a dead squirrel, mannequins, numerous self-portraits, and assorted gewgaws, all floating in the atrium, my fan heart sank. It seemed sedate, sparse, and anticlimactic, less clusterfuck and more inchoate limbo. A bang and a whimper, the sum total of a life's work rendered as pure spectacle. Saltz did observe, though, that without spatial, chronological, or textual ordering, we're thrown back on our own devices. As exhibition viewers, I suppose, that's where we always are when encountering an exhibition, suspended somewhere between our own devices, our immediate impression and personal reading of the work, and the ordering devices, whatever form they might take, of the exhibition maker. Why start with such a bizarre and atypical example of this particular exhibition form? I'm hardly advancing it as a general model for future practice. I'm rather using it to pose the question of what Catalan might have refused, what these ordering devices, the conventions of a conventional chronological retrospective might be, and why an artist might wish to resist them. I'll give you just another example, painting by Ed Ruscha of 1979, which appeared on the cover of his retrospective show at SF MoMA quite soon after. After all, an artist's concerns about being wrapped up by exhibition conventions must also preoccupy the curator working on an artist no longer living. The monographic exhibition is ubiquitous. Its form might appear so familiar to us as not to need comment, but there's much at stake in the endeavour for the visitor, for the art, and not least for the subject, the artists themselves, especially, though not exclusively, if they're living. A re-encounter with all I ever did. How strange, how daunting an exposure might that be. I speak here first and foremost as an exhibition maker. You could almost say it's all I've ever done. I first left the courtyard some 40 years ago, as I said, for the gallery world, and that's where I spent the better part of my life, with artists, curators, art historians, interpreters and designers in London and abroad, some of whom are here tonight. Now, back here, for 16 years I've been questioning what it is I've always been engaged in and still am. I want to draw on what I've done, what I've taught and thought about what I've done, with colleagues, curators, and most importantly, with students. And talking of talking, what's nourished me and sustained me recently are conversations with Frances Morris, my wife, as ever, and also with Eleanor Nairn, who can't be here. Eleanor convinced me to ask the dumb questions, and also convinced me that this was a subject that was interesting to people as young and bright as her, which was good. What I have to say now looks backwards, and I hope forwards. My research on this subject lies, I hope, in the future. I shan't be giving you firm research conclusions, rather a set of questions that I've been setting myself over the last year or so, and aim to pursue over the next few years. So this is more a statement of intent than of even preliminary findings. It's a setting out of territory. What I hope in asking these questions is that they might resonate with your own areas of interest, practice or experience, whether as art historians, as artists, as curators, either active or aspiring, or perhaps best and most widely, as visitors of exhibitions yourselves. It has to do with what the exhibition does and how exhibition practice is shaped by and shapes audiences, the changing art world, and art history, questions central to the curating programme from the start. The programme I run was conceived in 2007 as an extension, as Chris says, of the Courtaulds' art historical teaching, and as a response to a growing demand, it was felt, for curatorial studies, as well as to what some thought back then, to the attention between the worlds of the museum and the university, and approaches to a common field. The two art histories, to use a phrase current at the time. The discipline is promoted respectively by the university and the museum. And even to a concern among some, and Chris will remember this, that new, more theoretical directions in art history, setting themselves either against the more hidebound or the more populist aspects of museum practice, were in danger of moving away from close attention to the object, an attention that's been an article of faith at the Courtaulds since its beginnings. Museums, too, for some decades had been on the move, turning from their traditional practices of scholarship around the collection to more outward-looking priorities. As a case in point, the last and final illustrated catalogue of acquisitions at the Tate Gallery, the anonymised, writing of which was the major task of curators back then, or keepers as they were known, was published in 1996. National museums had lost their direct government funding, moving to a more arm's-length relationship with their paymasters, and seeing incremental cuts to their budget each year. In the neoliberal climate of the 80s and on, they were forced to act in a more entrepreneurial manner, to broaden their audiences, to look for corporate funding, or increasingly, to the market. The relatively new phenomenon of the blockbuster exhibition was the subject of hot debate. A threat to scholarship, or a much-needed acknowledgement of this broader public? At the same time, museums have begun to reassess their approach to display, permanent displays giving way to permanent rehangs. Conventional, canonical art historical thinking, Magicien de la Terre at the Pompidou in Paris, Another Story at the Hayward in London, non-white, non-Western, and progressive biennials such as that in Havana, were pressing for a more globalized post-colonial discourse, new frames and understandings of art, history, and its canons. I began with this programme against that background, with exhibitions now firmly at the forefront of museums' agenda, and for the first time receiving widespread critical attention from art historians, curators, and curatorial studies alike, as powerful agents in the dynamic of the museum, the art history, and the art world. A nexus, the institutional space, it's been claimed, in which the two art histories most often encounter one another. They've become a new subject for scrutiny, with their intentions and influence, the facts and circumstances of their making, their authorship, their means and aims, how they work as an experience, and what their effects and their legacy might be. There was a new thinking about exhibitions, to steal the title of a seminal anthology, co-edited by Sandy Mearns, in the 90s. So why my focus on monographic exhibitions? Well, two reasons. First, I suppose, because of all this new thinking, the monographic exhibition as a form seems to have been relatively sidelined. Bruce Altshuler, doyen of museum studies and exhibition history, published two large anthologies in 2008 and 2013, comprising case studies of significant shows from the 1860s to our day, to highlight the exhibition as driving force in a new understanding of art history. And yet he focused solely on group or thematic shows, a constraint, Altshuler acknowledged, without further elaboration. And when you read the literature of curatorial studies, the monographic show is not a prime focus, nor on the face of it is it the medium through which aspiring curators would expect to make their mark. The heat seemed always to be elsewhere. The key figures for curatorial studies still tend to be those who work outside the institution, often in the orbit of the biennial, documenta, manifesta, curators who set their imprimatur on a field, concept or theme, conform to the notion of the curator's auteur, and more broadly it seems, that in historical research in general now, with its focus on the interdisciplinary and the intersectional, interest has veered away from the exhibition of the individual artist. And yet, the second reason, the solo exhibition remains omnipresent, the most popular exhibition type in terms of audience. Some statistics in the Art Newspaper's 2019 listed figures pre-COVID, of the top 10 London exhibitions, in terms of audience, 7 were solo shows. Anthony Gormley at the Royal Academy shading Van Gogh the top slot, I'm just saying that. 7 out of 10 in New York, 6 out of 10 in Paris. Of 19th century exhibitions, 8 out of 10. The remaining 2 being the Courtaulds Impressionism show in Paris and Tokyo. Of Old Masters in 2018, 8 out of 10. So it's at once, it seems, the most popular exhibition type in terms of audience, popular reviews, and yet, in terms of serious scholarship, the most under-regarded, the subject hiding in plain sight, if you like. Is this because the monographic form itself is deemed so conventional, so self-evident as not to merit attention? Does its very popularity count against it? It is, after all, the bedrock, the bread and butter of exhibition programs, the driver of museum economies, and crucially, the major influence on and within the art market. With notable exceptions, David Solkin and Francis Haskell, 2 among them, it's only been in recent years that the origins and history of the monographic exhibition have begun to receive more widespread attention, particularly from a curatorial viewpoint. I won't, in a short lecture, cite literature, but I acknowledge it. Most of this scholarship to date has been done on the historical early modern origins of the one-person show, the self-organised and self-promoting personal exhibitions of the late 18th century, in London, say, Nathaniel Hone, Copley, Gainsborough, through Courbet's important self-arranged retrospective in Paris in 1855, and the dealer shows in Paris from the 1880s on, at Lucas, at Durand-Ruel's, at Georges Petit, and on the remarkable rise of retrospective exhibitions in the first decade of the 20th century of the post-impressionists shortly after their deaths, Van Gogh, Seurat, Cézanne et al. Exhibitions that saw the artist's work catalogued and that played such a crucial role in establishing their critical and market reputation, in solidifying the canon of modern art. And so it's an important point here to note that the origins of the monographic lay in self-promotional endeavour, and since its early development, it was the commercial galleries that took the lead and public museums that followed. My interest is framed by the emergence of these early modern exhibitions, and it's remarkable how much of these same names, Cézanne, Seurat, and Van Gogh, along with Matisse and Picasso, still occupy centre stage. Why might that be? My aim is to trace the shifting forms and methodologies of the monographic, to question the ways in which it can act as a progressive force, and, crucially, to assess how it can hold up against the market forces that played a large part in birthing it, and which surely still retain a crucial hold. My own entry into the curatorial world around 1990 feels now like something of a heyday of the monographic show, the retrospective. The claims made for it back then, made in advance, and principally by the museum's marketing departments, were consistent, if not hyperbolic. The exhibition would be comprehensive, sometimes the largest ever, even definitive. It would throw new light. It was timely, sometimes the first in a generation, though how long these days is a generation. Or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, even apocalyptically never to be repeated. Though inevitably they were and still are. Is this mere marketing speak or a reflection of curatorial intention? So, if you'll allow a personal retrospective moment and to give you some of my interest, I'll take you back by way of example to an exhibition I was involved in, my point of entry, the retrospective of the Belgian surrealist Magritte at the Hayward, the year after I joined the gallery, in 1992. As exhibition organizer, as we were called, I was working with co-selectors Sarah Whitfield and David Sylvester, primarily day-to-day with David, whose idea the show had been. Selector was their title, not curator. Keenly maintained that there was no such verb as to curate. David was what you would then have called an eminence, having worked in London and internationally for 4 decades as a writer, critic and teacher, and on major exhibitions such as Dada and Surrealism with Don Ellis, and solo shows of Henry Moore, Soutine, Giacometti, Francis Bacon and many more, all artists for whom he felt a kind of proprietary responsibility, including the last Magritte show at the Tate Gallery in the late 60s, soon after the artist's death. He'd spent the decades since engaged on a massive 3-volume catalogue raisonné of Magritte, and he just published a monograph on the artist. He knew where the works were buried, who the collectors were, he had the confidence of the museum directors, and so brought unrivaled clout to the loans process for a gallery without a collection of its own to trade. There was to be little compromise in thinking, selection, or physical in the first moment. Sylvester's selection was based on quality, criteria for which were no doubt hotly debated, but not overtly stated, at least not for the audience. Selection was based on judgment, made before the actual work, and independent of received opinion. The works chosen from all over the world were those deemed to be the artist's best. The exhibition, I shall take you through it, unrolled on the walls of the gallery in 2 tones of mid-grey, through spaces designed by the architect Paul Williams, here tonight, a prescribed route, following a rigid chronological sequence. The selection had been debated, work by work, for over a year, the installation equally so. It took place in the space over 3 long weeks of deliberation. It began with Magritte's earliest Cubist and Futurist-inspired works, as you see here, works on canvas and works on paper, these last confined to the back of the catalogue, and led on to the dark, majestic, and walking you through the show. Early surrealist works of the mid and late 20s hung in the upper galleries in a nave-like space designed by Paul Williams with side chapel, each work purposely isolated from the next, floating on a grey expanse, often with a single work in a dedicated space, floating on a grey, in the manner of an icon to be encountered frontally, as if with reverence. And so it continued through the gallery, work upon work, unadorned by words, no room titles, no artist quotations to inflect the progress, unaccompanied by ephemera, biographical detail, or contextual material, all of which was consigned to the catalogue. The revisionist seen here was its inclusion of those 2 bodies of work from what had previously been thought to be aberrant periods in Magritte's oeuvre, the so-called Vache and Impressionist works of the 1940s, works that had not perhaps before been deemed part of the artist's modernist trajectory, part of his own canon. Otherwise, a stately order ruled. Three posthumously produced bronze sculptures ended the flow. The central aim of Sylvester's, I believe, was to rescue Magritte from the world, from the enthusiastic clutches of the media and the advertising industry, which had echoed and exploited his images, almost as a brand, for decades, to present him as a painter and maker of paintings rather than a mere image maker. Whether he believed this 100% or not, I'm not sure, but he made the case convincingly. What then were Sylvester's ordering devices, to return to that phrase I used at the beginning? Was the show conventional, comprehensive? Was it canonical, spectacular, celebratory? Did it retrieve Magritte, represent him differently, or merely affirm his canonical status? Some of you will have seen the exhibition, some remember it well. Many of you won't have done. But for me then, it seemed to be an exhibition making at its finest. It's still clear in my memory. The way it inhabited the Hayward space, sought to convey meaning, encourage appreciation and understanding so largely through the role of installation. Its chronological frame, its absolute separation of art and life, its elimination of the provisional or preparatory of Magritte's work in the commercial sphere, its faith in the power of the works alone, given their space to do the work. Now it seems to stand for me It seems to me to stand for a particular kind of retrospective, consummate of its kind, and yet somehow in the past. It's not my intention to denigrate the show, it was magnificent. I'm saying rather that such an exhibition, conceived in this manner, seems hardly thinkable now. The notion of a commanding authorial voice, given such a free hand, and held to account by no more than a superb selection of works and an immaculate display. I feel that I caught the tail end of a particular way of making such exhibitions. 30 years on, how have approaches changed? What has forced the change? And has the broad perception of monographic shows really moved on to account for these changes? It would seem in some ways that it's still viewed in some quarters as the normative speech of exhibition making. The curator Jean Riba, writing in 2015 of the form or grammar of monographic or solo shows, could still characterize them as adhering to certain tacit conventions: chronology, connoisseurship, evaluation, establishing of a reputation, and mediation, by which he implied a subsuming of the curator's own perspective in an attempt to represent the artist's voice. Riba's claims merit attention, and none of them are new. They certainly speak to David Sylvester's ordering devices. Most might have been, indeed, many were, levelled at the gallery-led solo exhibitions of the 1880s and 90s, a century ago. To what extent, then, do they really still apply? Is the monographic form so much at odds with so inappropriate a form to which to engage with a wider interrogation of art history? How are these conventions being challenged? To take chronology first. And you could argue that some artists still lend themselves more readily to chronological treatment than others. The logical development of Mondrian's work, for example, plotted so painstakingly in strict chronological sequence by Yves Alambois and others in the artist retrospective in The Hague in 1994, that was here at MoMA, New York, the following year, conveyed a convincing and compelling account of the artist's progress, work by work. The inner necessity of Mondrian's progression came to the fore. But what form of editing did this entail? What might have been left out in this order? Might such canonical approaches not refine the canon by excluding works that don't somehow meet the criteria? For Sylvester, no matter how you might try, you couldn't buck chronology. It would reassert, he wrote in 2000, is not a tool of art historical interpretation, which could be used at one moment, discarded at another. It's an objective reality, built into the fabric of the work and into the artist's awareness. Sylvester, even then, was arguing against a climate in which many museums, as they have done over more than 2 decades now, were challenging or dispensing with it, and its canonical narrative of relentless progression. And I think here also the artist Linda Lockland's observation in relation to exhibitions that there is a tendency to use chronology as teleology, as proof of a march towards a goal. Is it then necessarily the most efficient means of accounting for the shape of a life's work, the complexities of causality? Artists might disagree. Picasso, hanging his own first retrospective, and a pioneer in doing so, with the Galerie Georges Petit in Paris in 1932, arranged his works on the wall with no sense of chronology, in an attempt, and I borrow here from Alma Mikulowski, to prevent his work from ossifying into a canonical narrative, to escape being institutionalized. Mikulowski quotes Picasso as saying, "An exhibition, whether it's well or badly arranged, it comes to the same thing. What counts is the sense of continuity in the artist's ideas." The subsequent showing of the exhibition, the Kunsthaus Zurich, the same year, was sorted back into chronological order by the museum's director. Picasso's response, "I feel like I am witnessing a retrospective vision of myself 10 years after my death." Almost a century on, the Italian art and cover artist Giuseppe Benoni suggested something similar in regard to his own retrospective at the Nasher Sculpture Centre in Dallas in 2015. It's not a traditional retrospective, he maintained. There is no linearity to it, no sense of work developing and running its course. There's a continuous back and forth of thought. I believe that the constant rebounding effect that one has in life is also there in the work. We might think here too of Louise Bourgeois' often stated explanation of her working method. I do, I undo, I redo. Neither does a chronological account necessarily entail a complete account of the artist's oeuvre. What is left out might encompass whole periods of work not deemed to fit the narrative. The distinguished curator Bill Rubin, mounting an exhibition of de Chirico's work, so it's only a notational image, so I'm afraid, mounting an exhibition of de Chirico's paintings at MoMA in New York back in 1982, 4 years after the artist's death, initially proposed a selection of works drawn only from the artist's metaphysical period of the 1910s, describing de Chirico's later works as a tragedy turned into farce. He was talked down from this, surely suspect and exclusionary position by his collaborators on the project. The flip side of this coin might be the approach of adopting a chronological focus to re-examine and re-evaluate particular periods of an artist's oeuvre, deemed to have been forgotten or overlooked. Indeed, de Chirico's later work has itself been the subject of entire exhibitions. Even Picasso could be a candidate for such treatment. The Tate Gallery's late Picasso exhibition, for example, back in 1998, focused on the artist's post-52 work that had, by the curators, been substantially neglected. Linda Nochlin, writing on Louise Bourgeois in 2008, made a distinction between late style and old age style. I won't go into it, but I draw on it because the one, late style, seems to pertain to the work, the other, old age, to say something more about life. And I use it to point to an issue that frames, or that seems to me, the most significant shifts in thinking about the monographic, an issue that Sylvester effectively stood aside from in his exhibition of Magritte. The inclusion in the exhibition of Biography, the relation of the art to the life, the shape of the art, the shape of the life. How does one reflect the other? My colleague Jo Aplin alluded to this in a recent professorial lecture, forgive me, Jo. Addressing her subject, which was late style, she spoke of the strategic use value of biography. She said also, I'm aware I've allowed myself to slip into anecdote, but as art historians, we are rightly suspicious of life stories, unless it's more interesting than the work. Why might we still feel this resistance? What implications does it have for the exhibition? The writing of the life and the interrogation of the work have always coexisted. They were written into art history from Vasari on. For which reason, not surprisingly, suspicion and awareness of the pitfalls, the slippage of fact or anecdote into fiction or myth, is deep-rooted. It's almost a century since Ernst Chris and Otto Kurtz advanced their famous critique of the legend, myth, and magic of the artist, the long-standing urge to link our artist's character to their work, and expose the pervasive tropes of such heroization. Such ideas as the idea of the divine origins of artistic genius, the notion of predestination, the early premonitory signs of special talent, the special nature of the teacher-artist relationship. They were warning of the dangers, in short, of the attempt to make the process of artistic creativity comprehensible through the use of analogous life experiences. We can be right to resist or to treat with caution at least artists' own utterance on their work. There are those who might prefer to effect a silence on the matter, letting the work speak for itself. Works of art, writes Michael Craig Martin, are not mute, waiting for interpretation. They also always tell the truth. Artists uniquely expose their position through their work. If you know my work, I believe you already know me. Nevertheless, and despite all this, what an artist says and writes remains an indispensable primary resource, and surely should be interrogated as such. The real Van Gogh, the artist in his letters, presented a compelling conjunction of artists' famous works and equally famous words. And there is still in many curatorial projects a manifest desire to get as close to the artist's voice as possible. The hoisting of artist quotes on walls in large text has become a frequent activity. Here, for example, those of the American painter Philip Guston in his recent Tate Modern retrospective, of which more in a while. Those words being, do an artist's words have a special claim to truth? What can they reveal? Is the elevation of the artist's voice in words, in exhibitions, myth-busting or myth-building? Possibly both at the same time, as an artist self-mythologizing can provide insight into their persona. A favourite of mine in the booklet accompanying Eve Klein's retrospective at Tate in 1974. I've enlarged the words at the bottom. I arrived on Earth in 1928. Born into a milieu of painters, I acquired my taste for painting with my mother's milk. We may question the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama's attribution of her inspiration to childhood hallucinatory episodes, or the American abstract painter Agnes Martin's summoning of internal instantaneous inspiration in what Francis has called the birthing myth of her signature grid paintings. Such avowals suggest perhaps a certain generational resistance to being shoehorned into modernist structures of originality, influence and association. And we should remember Louise Bourgeois again, who also famously rejected labels and associations with other artists, and who used her personal life story more consistently and effectively than most, also warned, an artist's words are always to be taken cautiously. The artist who discusses the so-called meaning of his work, yes, his, is usually describing a literary side issue. The core of his original impulse is to be found in the work itself. Just the same, the artist must say what he feels. And yet an engagement with the artist's own self-projection can broaden the picture, counter the chronological flow, bring in the life. The curator of Gauguin, maker of myth at Tate Modern in 2011, Belinda Thompson, set herself to explore the artist's use of his own life as a narrative strategy, seeing his self-promotional urge as, in her words, central to his making of art, and not, as has been a tendency in the past, as an incidental biographical factor. She set out, and I'm sorry, I don't have the images of this, to avoid the pitfalls of modernism, the setting aside of subject matter, to focus on issues of reception, identity, displacement and migration, self-presentation and self-promotion. All seem to be not merely of biographical interest, but as essential to the making and the reading of the work. In such a way, it seems the biographical can be subjected to serious scholarly historical interrogation in the exhibition, woven into the broader scale of social, political and economic context, the forces of identity politics, institutional and critical reception. Another example, close to home, Jungles in Paris, Henri Rousseau, Jungles in Paris, which Chris and Francis curated for Tate Modern in 2005, in which they dispensed with a chronological approach to the work, any attempt to foreground stylistic development over time in favour of an alternative frame. Their aim here was to counter a prevailing critical view of Rousseau as a naive artist, untethered from this context, free of external influence or strategic ambition, a figure ridiculed in his time by public and establishment alike. They placed the artist firmly in the entwined worlds of the academic, the naive and the avant-garde, more self-aware and sophisticated, anticipating rather than standing apart from the innovations of 20th century modernity. And it brought into the exhibition space popular representations of colonial conquest in popular magazines, objects from the zoological galleries of the Natural History Museum. This is Emmanuel Frenier's Gorillas from 1887. This from the Jardin des Plantes, with extensive documentation, and undeniably resident works and objects sharing space with Rousseau's own work, to show Rousseau's concerns were lived and shared, that the jungle was not only in the artist's head, but could be encountered by anyone walking the city. The jungle was not just a fantasy, it was Paris. Bringing the work into the world then, as if the wider world would wait. I can't think of a more timely case than that of the recent exhibition Philip Guston, mounted here at Tate Modern and at 3 venues in the US, in Boston, Washington, where I also saw it, and Houston. Never, in my experience, has an exhibition been so hotly debated before it opened, with entrenched positions on all sides. In the insistent context of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, every aspect of institutional and curatorial positioning was placed under the most intense scrutiny before the event. The case is worth a lecture in itself and goes beyond the bounds of my subject, but the issues it raises, the focus on the white artist's engagement with what many took to be potentially incendiary subject matter, the artist's own lived experience and its complex effects on his motivations and handling of such material, the complexion and positioning of the various curatorial teams working at each venue, who was telling whose story and for who, considerations of lived experience on the part of the artist, the curator, and of the audience, and the spectre of what one critic, Ben Davis, described as context collapse, the inability on the part of the organisers to control the interpretive context of an utterance or an image, are all intensely relevant. The world, the life, takes centre stage. Many of you will have seen the show and formed your own opinions of it here. Two tangential points seem of interest to me, though, in terms of the monographic. One, the ways in which teams of curators in each of the 4 museums presented and interpreted essentially the same body of work for their respective audiences, their own context, in such radically different ways, putting forward different chronological and thematic frames, staging in effect an argument within an exhibition almost, which is an intriguing idea. And second, the way in which Michael Whelan at Tate Modern, presenting an American artist to a less familiar British public, highlighted throughout the artist's own lived experience, his relation to the wider world, and in so doing resorted to what was, by and large, a chronological structure for work and its attendant interpreted materials. But there's so much to unpick here. What might link the so different cases of Gauguin and Rousseau even Guston? Despite all of them being fully inscribed within the hierarchy of modern Western art, they could all, in a sense, be taken in some ways as outsiders, whether involuntarily, by circumstance, or by self-definition. And this despite the fact, as you'll have noticed, that they're all still white, male, and Western. But bringing the world to the art in all cases seems to be a powerful mechanism for rethinking or problematizing the contributions of artists who, to a greater or lesser extent, call for reassessment of their position within the canon. There are stories to be told that won't yield readily to inquiry or assessment simply in formal or stylistic terms. Stories that challenge the ideological underpinnings that continue to govern the limited, white, Eurocentric, gendered hierarchy of artistic value. And here the full course of art history's trajectory over the last 50 years bursts back in. Griselda Pollock's long-standing and authoritative problematizing of the complexities of the feminist project of differencing the canon, the recuperation of women artists within it, involves questioning the very tenets of the canon itself, allowing in discontinuities and specificities, and continues to call for new and experimental formats for examining the work for different voices. Post-colonial discourse, too, demands new ways of approaching the monographic form, given its heavy baggage. I leave that as a vast area, which I have obviously to think a lot more about and not time to confront here. But I would mention only 2 notable recent exhibitions of examples of exhibition in London, both at Tate Modern, giving new and fuller accounts of women artists in ways that could not have been attempted by the museum even 20 years ago. Sorry. What a sequence. Annie Albers. Annie Albers, working across a range of media and practices of making underregarded by the conventional canon, with process very much to the fore, and collaborative working methods. And Magdalena Abakanovic, whose hitherto unshone early textile work was so convincingly reinstated into an understanding of her larger sculpture oeuvre. Both projects can, through the form of the monographic exhibition, open up and assist in the re-evaluation of whole areas of practice, and lead on to other things. See the current Barbican group exhibition of artists working with textile, a show that acknowledges a depth to both solo exhibitions, suggesting at least a place for the monographic project in the broader ecology of exhibition making, as well as art history. Our colleague, the late John House, ruminating on his own curating experience in 2022, argued that monographic shows cannot be seriously revisionist, even at presenting non-canonical artists. The comparative principle, he said, is vital, and the only way to achieve this is through a show conceived thematically. An interesting provocation in terms of this subject, but whatever one might make of it, changing practice in what might be thought of as a fraying of the monographic form has increasingly brought comparative work by other artists into the monographic frame. Barbara Hepworth at Tate Britain in 2015 presented the sculptor's works alongside works by her predecessors and peers, Jacob Epstein, Henry Moore, and Eric Gill. And Lynn Cook, curating a solo exhibition of Rosemary Trockle at the New Museum in New York, this is an image from the Serpentine to which it travelled, set her work in dialogue with, in her words, famous or little-known travelling companions, artists working, artists not commonly regarded in art history, in market. contemporary artists are increasingly brought in to provide contemporary perspectives on, responses to the work of their predecessors. I can only think about the recent Cézanne exhibition at Tate Modern, where artists were invited, called upon, and their presence, their words were felt in the space and alongside the work. Controversial in some stages, as of course were contemporary voices brought in to propose a post-colonial commentary on the work of William Hogarth in Tate Britain in 2021. So to the form of the double retrospective, an established strategy since the late 19th century, has been opened up beyond the conventional entwining of canonical figures, the stylistic tag wrestling of Picasso Matisse or Picasso Braque, for example, to name obvious examples, that reinforced conventional attention to stylistic allegiance, mutual influence, and originality. That the juxtaposition as presented at Tate Modern last year of a canonical figure such as Mondrian with a newly resurfaced Swedish artist Hilma af Klint, contemporaries who never met, the teasing out of potential synergies between two artists whose response to currents of thinking in the wider world led to different trajectories in their work, differing receptions, that such an encounter, rich in ideas and perspectives, raised critical eyebrows in some quarters, may point to a persistent canonical thinking prompted by the monographical or double monographical format of the exhibition, an expectation that we should pit their work against each other, evaluate them in the old way, according to modernist criteria of quality. But the exhibition was proposing instead a changing of the rules of that game. Different works, different contexts. Here, Mondrian's flower paintings, which unsurprisingly made no appearance in the 1990s retrospective. Meeting af Klint's studies of weeds, just as an example. All this might suggest that the, all this, can we just leave that for a second? All this might suggest that the monographic exhibition can play a part in the broader questioning of modernism's hold on art history, alongside other group and thematic constructs. Maybe the terms of engagement are changing. The French artist Sophie Calle, invited to conceive a solo exhibition in the Musée Picasso in Paris, to mark the 50th anniversary of the artist's death, unhung or covered the master's work to put her own in place. An intense dialogue resulted, despite this, but on Sophie Calle's own terms, the tables turned. And yet, the canon clings on. That year, over 50 Picasso exhibitions were mounted alongside the Pompidou's massive 1,000 work retrospective of his drawings. This leads us, I'm afraid, inevitably back to the market. João Ribas, in his 2015 analysis, also held monographic exhibitions to be tainted by their largely celebratory, spectacularized and market-driven focus, entangled as they are in what he describes as the dealer-collector, museum-curator nexus. Who gets to be seen remains, in large part, a market choice. It was estimated in 2015 that nearly 1/3 of the major solo exhibitions held in US museums between 2007 and 2013 featured artists represented by just 5 commercial galleries. Pre-COVID, an analysis of London's exhibitions revealed a marked increase in auction house, dealer and collector support for monographic exhibitions. At one moment, Bridget Riley's exhibition at the Hayward was supported by Sotheby's and a trio of her own galleries, Lucian Freud's at the RA by Phillips and a number of dealers, Albert Erland's at the Serpentine by Sotheby's as lead support, alongside a trio of galleries, all of whom staged simultaneous commercial shows of the artist. While we might see this as a giving back in a philanthropic, circular economy, such collaboration clearly benefits the market, the sales and legacy of those artists, all well embedded in the marketplace already, reinforcing and even restricting the range of those who might enter that top tier. This situation is unlikely to improve. With the increasing gathering of artist estates in the hands of the super galleries, the market stake in the reputational economy of monographic shows seems only likely to increase. And the worlds elide. Think of the art historian John Richardson's curating Picasso shows for Gagosian, or MoMA New York's chief curator emeritus, John Elderfield's current position also as senior curator for special exhibitions at the same gallery, Gagosian. It's something in which, let's admit it, art historians and public museum curators, many of us, increasingly play our part. If this seems evident, monographic exhibitions still constitute a reputational economy. The influence of the market is increasingly to be interrogated and, if possible, resisted, even as it becomes ever more insistent. The economic realities of museums during and post-COVID have seriously dented the resilience of the blockbuster model in the public museums. Environmental imperatives have put it into question, and rightly so, the viability of attempts to mount comprehensive representations of artists from multiple sources across the world. Other ways are being found. At the same time, the persistent emergence of immersive experiences needs to be negotiated. New thinking is called for. I realise I'm posing more questions than offering answers here, as I said I would. And though my questions are grounded in my own experience, many have articulated what I've set out to you before me, I'm sure. There's more talking to be done, important case studies reflecting interesting practice to be found. I played rather fast and loose with the limits of what a monographic exhibition might be. Firmer definitions are needed. And I've deliberately stuck close to home in the exhibitions I've lit on tonight, partly because I'm at an early stage, partly because I wanted to focus on examples which more of you may have visited and or be familiar with. Indeed, they're those that I've taken my students to over the years. They remain, regrettably, this may be the territory, but there's still no excuse for it, male and white, which would certainly not be any part of my intention going on. It may be that, like the artist, the monographic exhibition is best assessed not in isolation, but in company with other exhibition forms, as part of a broader ecology of exhibition making and art history. A resilient form still capable of change, still with a potential for progressive development. Curators are ever less likely to be given license to single-handedly lay down a definitive presentation of a solo artist, such as Sylvester was, to assert their own singular judgment. If I can discern a positive trend, I'd say that it's in the potential for the monographic exhibition, as others, to remain interrogative, if it's thought to be of less as setting a seal on or reiterating an artist's status and reputation, more as a learning process. The curatorial pursuit of the monographic need no longer be thought of as a normative, even self-effacing activity in that way. There's space for a more exploratory and more collaborative process in which curators, free of an initial curatorial thesis required for a group or thematic exhibition, can come fresh to an artist, begin with a space and the work. And so the curatorial process itself retains the capacity to make discoveries, to see and think anew in the process of the exhibition's making. As the curator Elizabeth Sussman put it, reflecting on her experience of curating an exhibition of Paul Tech at the Whitney in New York in 2010, the fascination for an artist nearly always emerges during the making of an exhibition, and it's not always completely apparent at the beginning. And also the making of a show causes my perception of a whole swathe of art history to be transformed, rejigged. The evanescence, the fleeting physical nature of the exhibition is inherent in its very form. It's both its fascination and its challenge. And of course, curatorial intention and immediate public critical reception can be two very different things, as any exhibition curator who reads the reviews the day after their show's opening can attest. And yet the best exhibitions leave a long tail, generate new projects and new research. What I leave you with is the simple idea that the monographic exhibition is unlikely to disappear, destined inevitably to evolve. The exhibition-making process is by definition a matter of choice, of selection, but the trajectory of the monographic needs to be from exclusion to inclusion, no longer sustained by what it leaves out, rather by what it allows in. There, I've hung all my thoughts out for you, such as they are at this stage. As with most exhibitions, I'm sure there are glaring omissions, no doubt some wrong thinking. That's rather timely. It's work to be continued, but for now, I've given you what, for now, is my all. Thank you.